The whole hall went quiet, hundreds of the finest scholars in the galaxy, gone silent all at once, not because the human girl gave a brilliant answer to the unanswerable question. The hall went silent because she gave the one answer none of them had ever had the courage to give. And I was sitting 3 rows back, a frightened young student myself, watching it happen, and I have never forgotten the sound of all that silence or the small steady voice that caused it. Let me tell you where we were, and who she was, and what the question was, because none of it makes sense without all 3. My name is Teppa. I am of the Andi, and at the time of this story I was a student at the Great Athenaeum of Sef, which, if you do not know it, is the oldest and most revered center of learning in the galaxy. The Athenaeum is not a government. It is something the galaxy holds in even higher regard than its governments. It is the place where the finest minds of every species come to study, to teach, to push at the edges of what can be known. To be a student, there was the honor of a lifetime. To be a professor, there was to stand among the most respected beings alive. The great hall of the Athenaeum, where the most important lectures and debates were held, had seen 10,000 years of the galaxy's deepest thought, and the scholars who filled it, the assembled faculty and senior students, what we half-jokingly called the Council of the Athenaeum, were as close to the concentrated wisdom of the galaxy as existed anywhere. I was a very junior student. I was lucky to be in that hall at all. And I was there that day to watch the most famous professor of the Athenaeum deliver his challenge. The same challenge he delivered once a year, the same challenge no one had ever met, to a hall that included, for the first time in the Athenaeum's history, a human. I want you to feel what that hall was like, because the place itself is part of the story. The great hall of the Athenaeum was built to make you feel small, not cruelly, but in the way that a vast old cathedral of learning makes you feel small, by surrounding you with the accumulated thought of 10,000 years. The walls were lined with the names of the great scholars of every age, species I had never heard of, minds that had reshaped how the galaxy understood itself, carved into stone that had stood for longer than my own people had been spacefaring. The light came down from high windows in long soft shafts. The acoustics were such that a whisper at the center could be heard in the highest row, which meant that the silences in that hall were total. A kind of silence I have never encountered anywhere else, the silence of hundreds of brilliant beings all holding still together. And to be a student in that hall was to feel, every day, the weight of all that achievement pressing down on you, the unspoken question of whether you would ever be worthy of the names carved into the walls. Most of us were terrified, underneath our scholarly poise. The Athenaeum did not encourage you to admit it. The whole culture of the place was confidence, mastery, the performance of knowing, because to be at the Athenaeum was to be among those who knew, and to admit that you did not know, that you were frightened, that you were out of your depth, would have been a kind of failure. I mention this now because it is the soil out of which the whole story grows. The Athenaeum was a place that had forgotten how to say I don't know, and it took a human girl to remind it. I should confess that I was as caught in it as anyone, more perhaps, because I was junior and frightened and desperate to belong. I had learned, in my time at the Athenaeum, to perform certainty I did not feel. When a senior scholar asked me a question I could not answer, I had learned to produce a confident-sounding response built of borrowed phrases and educated guesses, rather than admit the simple truth that I did not know. We all did it. It was the water we swam in. The whole Athenaeum was a vast, elaborate performance of knowing, hundreds of brilliant beings all terrified that they would be the one exposed as not knowing enough, all covering that terror with confidence, all of us nodding sagely at things we did not understand because to do otherwise was to fail. And the strange, sad thing, the thing I only understood later, is that this performance did not serve knowledge at all. It strangled it, because you cannot learn what you will not admit you do not know. You cannot ask the question whose asking would reveal your ignorance. A place built entirely on the performance of certainty becomes, underneath, a place where no one can ever truly say, I don't understand, help me, which is the only sentence out of which real learning ever grows. The Athenaeum, the greatest center of learning in the galaxy, had made itself, through its own pride, strangely incapable of the very humility that learning requires. We were all so busy seeming to know that we had half forgotten how to actually find out. I did not see this then. I was too deep inside it. It took watching a frightened human girl break the rule we were all enslaved to for me to see the cage we were all living in, the cage of having to seem to know. Let me tell you about Professor Saelen, because he is half of this story, and because the galaxy has mostly told his half wrong. Professor Saelen was of the Veth Corps, an ancient scholarly species, and he was the most celebrated mind at the Athenaeum, which is to say one of the most celebrated minds alive. He was very old. He had spent his entire long life, and the Veth Corps lived long on a single problem, a problem that had become known throughout the galaxy as the Saelen question, though he had not named it after himself. The galaxy had done that in tribute and in pity both. The Saelen question was, by reputation, unanswerable. It was the great problem of his field, a question so deep and so resistant that the finest minds of 100 generations had broken themselves against it and failed, and Professor Saelen had spent 60 years failing at it more thoroughly and more brilliantly than anyone in history. And every year at the great convocation of the Athenaeum, he posed it, formally, to the assembled scholars as a kind of ritual challenge. Here is the question: who will answer it? And every year, the hall sat in respectful silence, because no one would dare claim to answer the question that had defeated Professor Saelen, and the silence was understood by everyone as a kind of homage, a hall full of the galaxy's finest minds acknowledging together the limits of knowing. I have to tell you what the question actually was, because it matters, and because it is not what you would expect. The Saelen question was not a question about mathematics or physics or any of the hard sciences where a clever enough mind might one day find a proof. It was a question about meaning, about why there is something rather than nothing, about whether existence has a purpose, about whether the universe means anything at all or is simply a vast indifferent accident in which thinking creatures briefly flicker and then go out. Professor Saelen had spent 60 years trying to answer it rigorously, to prove with the full apparatus of Veth Corps scholarship that existence had meaning, or that it did not, one way or the other, definitively. And he had failed because it cannot be done, because it is the kind of question that the tools of scholarship are not built to answer. But he had never stopped trying, and the galaxy had come to revere him for the trying, and the annual posing of the question had become the Athenaeum's most solemn ritual. The great old professor asking the unanswerable thing, and the hall falling silent in acknowledgement that it could not be answered. I want to be careful in how I describe the question, because the way the Athenaeum framed it was itself part of the trap. The Veth Corps, and the Athenaeum after them, treated the question as a proof problem, a thing that had a correct answer somewhere, waiting to be derived, if only a mind were rigorous enough and patient enough to derive it. That was the whole assumption underneath 60 years of Professor Saelen's work and 10,000 years of the Athenaeum's pride, that any real question must have a knowable answer, that knowing was simply a matter of being clever enough, that the universe was a thing the mind could, in principle, fully master. And so the question was approached the way the Athenaeum approached everything, as a fortress to be stormed by intellect, a problem to be solved, a thing to be known. And every assault failed, and the failing was treated as a measure of the question's difficulty, rather than as a sign that the whole approach was wrong. It did not occur to the Athenaeum, it could not occur to a place built entirely on the worship of knowing, that some questions are not failures of knowledge to be eventually overcome, but live permanently in the territory of the unknowable, and that the right response to them is not a better proof, but a different relationship to not knowing entirely. The Athenaeum had no concept of that. The Athenaeum believed that to not know was always a temporary, shameful condition to be conquered. And so it had spent 10,000 years, and the whole life of its greatest scholar, hurling the most brilliant minds in the galaxy at a question that could not be answered the way they were trying to answer it, and calling the wreckage of all those minds reverence. I want to dwell on why it could not be answered, because it is the crux of everything that happened. The Athenaeum was built on a particular faith, the faith that any question, given enough brilliance and enough time, could be solved. That was the whole spirit of the place, that knowledge advanced, that the unknown retreated, that a mind sharp enough could eventually crack any problem the universe presented. And for most questions, this faith was justified. The Athenaeum had cracked a great many problems over its 10,000 years, but the Saelen question was different in kind, not merely in difficulty. It was not a locked door that the right key would open. It was a question that asked the universe to justify itself, to explain its own meaning. And the universe does not answer such questions, not because the answer is hidden, but because the question may have no answer of the kind the asker wants. Professor Saelen, the greatest mind of his age, had spent 60 years building more and more elaborate keys for a door that was not locked but painted on a wall. And the tragedy, the thing that made the whole ritual so quietly unbearable to watch, if you understood it, was that he could not stop. He had given his life to the faith of the Athenaeum, the faith that the question could be answered, and to admit that it could not be answered, that he had spent 60 years on something that scholarship simply could not reach, would have been to admit that his entire life had been a kind of beautiful mistake. So he kept asking, and the hall kept its reverent silence. And no one, not one of the finest minds in the galaxy, was willing to say the thing that would have freed him, because it was a thing the Athenaeum had trained all of us never to say. I should tell you also that there was something underneath the ritual that most of the students did not see, but that I, who watched people more than I studied my texts, had begun to notice. Professor Saelen was not at peace. The annual challenge had become, over the years, less a celebration of inquiry and more a kind of public grief. He was very old, near the end even by Vethcore measure, and he had given his entire life to a question he had not answered, and you could see if you looked, and I looked, that it weighed on him terribly. That he posed the question each year not in triumph, but in a kind of quiet desperation, hoping, against all his own scholarship, that someone, someday, would give him the answer he had failed to find, because he could not bear, I think, to die without it. The galaxy saw a great scholar nobly posing the great question. I saw an old man, frightened of his own approaching death, asking the universe whether his whole life had meant anything, and getting, every year, the same silence in return. I had seen him once when he did not know he was being watched, and the memory of it changed how I understood everything that came after. It was late, in one of the Athenaeum's libraries, and I had stayed too long over my texts, and I came around a shelf and found Professor Saelen sitting alone at a table, surrounded by his life's work, 60 years of notes and proofs and failed attempts at the question, and he was not working. He was simply sitting there, very still, an old being among his papers, and his face, which in the lecture hall was always composed into the serene mask of the great scholar, was not composed at all. It was the face of someone in pain, someone tired past telling, someone who had spent everything he had on a single question and was beginning to understand that he would die without the answer, and that all the reverence of the galaxy could not fill the hole that left in him. He did not see me. I backed away quietly and left him to his grief, but I never again believed the serene mask he wore in the hall. I knew, after that night, what the annual challenge really was. It was not a great scholar's noble ritual. It was an old, frightened, exhausted man asking, over and over, the only question that mattered to him: did my life mean anything? Does anything? And being met, every single year, by the polite, reverent, useless silence of a hall full of people who admired him too much to tell him the truth. And then that year, there was a human in the hall. Her name was Myra Castellanos, and she was an exchange student, young, even by human measure, one of the first humans ever admitted to the Athenaeum, and by no means a famous prodigy. She was an ordinary bright young person, out of her depth in the most rarefied institution in the galaxy, and most of us had barely noticed her among the hundreds of students. I doubt Professor Saelen knew her name. When he posed the Saelen question that year, as he had posed it for 60 years, to the silent Reverend Hall, he was not expecting an answer. No one was. The posing of the question was a ritual, and the silence was the ritual's response, and we all knew our parts. I had spoken to her, a little in the weeks before Myra. We shared a tutorial group, and I had noticed her the way you notice anyone who is struggling, because I was struggling too, and the struggling recognize each other. She was not the most brilliant student in our group. She admitted openly in a way that startled the rest of us. When she did not understand something, she would simply say, "I don't get this, can you explain it again?" And we found this bewildering, because at the Athenaeum you did not admit such things. You nodded sagely and went away and figured it out alone rather than reveal that you had not already known. Myra did not seem to have learned that rule, or did not care about it. She asked questions that the rest of us were too proud to ask. She said, "I don't know," as easily as the rest of us said our own names. At first I thought she was simply not very good, not Athenaeum material, a charity admission, the kind of student who would wash out within the year. It took me a long time and the events of that day to understand that I had it exactly backwards, that her willingness to say "I don't know" was not a weakness at all. It was the thing the rest of us, with all our pride and all our performance, had lost, and it was the most valuable thing in the entire Athenaeum, and none of us could see it because we had been trained not to. And then the human girl stood up. I remember the exact moment, because the whole hall felt it before anyone understood what was happening. Professor Saelen had posed the question in his old grave voice, and the silence had begun to settle, the familiar reverent silence, the ritual silence, the silence we all knew. And into that silence near the back there was a small sound, the sound of a single student getting to her feet. We all turned. Hundreds of us turned, the assembled wisdom of the Athenaeum, to see who would dare break the ritual silence, and it was the human girl Myra Castellanos, standing alone among the seated hundreds, small and young and visibly frightened, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. And she said, in a voice that shook but did not stop, "I'll accept the challenge, Professor. I'd like to try to answer the question." And the hall, which had been merely silent, became something else, became a held breath, a hush of disbelief and something close to scandal, because no one accepted the challenge. No one ever accepted the challenge, and certainly not a first-year human exchange student who could barely keep up in her tutorials. I felt my whole body go cold with second-hand fear for her. I thought she was about to humiliate herself in front of the finest minds in the galaxy. I could not have been more wrong about what was about to happen. Let me tell you what happened when Myra Castellanos rose, in that hall full of the galaxy's finest minds, and said that she would accept Professor Saelen's challenge, and what she actually said when she did, which was not a brilliant answer and was not a foolish one, and was something that none of the assembled wisdom of the Athenaeum had ever in 10,000 years dared to say out loud. Because the hall did fall silent. The whole council of the Athenaeum fell silent. But not for the reason the title of this story might make you think. They did not fall silent because a human had outthought them. They fell silent because a human had been brave enough to say the truest thing in the room, and it broke something open in that hall, and in an old dying professor that 60 years of brilliant scholarship never had. She said, "I don't know." That was the beginning of her answer to the greatest question in the galaxy. A first-year human exchange student stood up in the most revered hall of learning in existence, before the finest minds of 100 species, accepted the challenge that had defeated the galaxy's greatest scholar for 60 years, and the first thing out of her mouth was, "I don't know." And in that hall, where no one ever said those words, where saying them was the one unforgivable thing, you could have heard a breath drop. Let me tell you exactly what she said, because I have carried every word of it for the rest of my life. But first I have to tell you about the pause before she said it, because that pause is part of the answer, and it was the bravest thing I have ever watched. She had stood up and accepted the challenge, and now the whole hall was staring at her, hundreds of the galaxy's finest minds, the carved names of 10,000 years of genius looming over her, the great old professor waiting, every eye in that vast hall fixed on one small, frightened 19-year-old human who had just done the unthinkable. And she froze. For a moment, a long, terrible moment, she just stood there, and I could see her trembling from 3 rows away, and I thought, she is going to lose her nerve, she is going to sit down, she has realized what she has done and she cannot go through with it. And who could have blamed her? I would have sat down. Anyone would have sat down. The pressure of that hall, that silence, that expectation was crushing. I have felt it myself in far smaller moments and been unable to speak. But she did not sit down. She stood in the crushing silence and she breathed, and I watched her make a decision. I watched her choose, visibly, to be honest instead of safe, to speak instead of flee, and when she finally opened her mouth, her voice shook, but it did not stop. That is courage, I have come to understand, not the absence of fear, the choice to speak the truth while the fear is screaming at you to stay silent. She was more frightened in that moment than anyone in the hall, and she spoke anyway. That is why what she said landed the way it did. It came out of fear, not confidence, and that made it true. She stood there, this small, frightened young human, and she said, "Professor, I accepted your challenge, and now I have to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing I have that's worth anything in a room like this. I don't know the answer to your question. I can't prove whether existence has meaning. I can't prove that it doesn't. I'm 19 years old and I'm barely passing my classes, and I am the last person in this hall who could out-argue any of you." She took a breath. "But I don't think that's what you're actually asking. I've watched you pose this question. I read about you before I came here, and I don't think a man spends 60 years on a problem because he wants a proof. I think you want a proof because you're afraid of what it would mean if there isn't one. And I don't think anyone in this room has ever said that to you, because everyone here is too busy being impressed by the question to notice that you're not really asking it as a scholar. You're asking it as a person who's getting old and is afraid that none of it meant anything. And I can't give you a proof. But maybe I can answer the question you're actually asking, which is a different question, and I think it has an answer, even though the proof question doesn't." The hall was utterly silent now. I had never heard a silence like it. Hundreds of the galaxy's finest minds, frozen, because this child had just said aloud the thing all of us had seen, and none of us had ever dared name. That the great Professor Saelen's noble ritual was an old man's frightened cry, and that we had all been complicit in pretending otherwise. And Professor Saelen himself, I was watching him, had gone very still, in a way I had never seen, the serene scholarly mask simply gone from his old face, replaced by something raw and astonished, the face of someone who has been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. And Myra kept going, gently, so gently. She said, "Here's what I actually think, Professor, for whatever it's worth, from someone who can't prove any of it. I think you've been trying to answer the wrong question, and I think it's been killing you, and I think it's been killing this whole place, because everyone here is doing the same thing, trying to know things that maybe can't be known, and being ashamed of the not knowing like it's a failure. But what if it isn't a failure? What if some questions aren't problems to be solved but mysteries to be lived inside of? I don't know if existence has meaning. Nobody does. Nobody ever will, not with a proof. But I know that I love my parents, and I know that a sunrise on my homeworld can make me cry, and I know that when I helped another student who was struggling last week, something in me felt like it was doing exactly what it was made for. I can't prove any of that means anything, but it feels like meaning. It feels like meaning so strongly that the question of whether I can prove it starts to seem like the wrong question. Maybe meaning isn't something you prove. Maybe it's something you do. Maybe you don't find out whether life has meaning by solving it. Maybe you find out by living it, and loving things, and helping people, and letting the not knowing be okay, and the meaning is in the living, not in the answer. You spent 60 years trying to prove the water is wet, Professor, while you were standing in the rain the whole time." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing that I think finished it, the thing that went past the argument entirely and reached the old man directly. She said, "Can I tell you what I think your 60 years actually were? You think they were a failure because you never found the proof. But I read your work, the parts I could understand anyway. And what I saw wasn't a man failing to answer a question. I saw a man who cared so much about whether life had meaning that he gave his entire life to asking. Do you understand what that is? That's not failure. That's the answer. A person who could spend 60 years caring that deeply about whether anything matters, that person is the proof that something does. You were the answer to your own question the whole time, and you couldn't see it because you were looking for it on paper instead of in the mirror. Your caring was the meaning. It was always the meaning. You just thought meaning had to be something you could write down, and it isn't. It's something you already were." And then, very softly, almost too quietly for even the great acoustics to carry, she said, "I think you can rest now, Professor. I think you already answered it. I think you answered it 60 years ago, the first day you cared enough to ask. You just needed someone to tell you that the caring was the answer. So I'm telling you, it was enough. You were enough. You can put it down now." I want you to understand that this was not a brilliant philosophical argument. I have thought about it many times since, and a trained scholar could have picked it apart, could have raised a dozen objections, could have pointed out that she had not answered the question at all but merely dissolved it. And that is exactly the point. She had not out-argued the Athenaeum. She could not have. She was a child among masters. What she had done was something the Athenaeum's entire culture of brilliant argument was incapable of doing. She had told the truth, simply and without armor, including the truth of her own not knowing. And in doing so she had reached past 60 years of scholarship and touched the actual wound, the human-shaped wound under the question, the wound that no proof could ever have healed because it was never really a proof that was needed. I have to tell you what was happening inside me, and inside the hall as she spoke, because it was the strangest collective experience I have ever been part of. At first, when she began, there had been a ripple of something almost like embarrassment, the second-hand cringe of watching someone about to fail publicly, the wince of "oh no, the poor human, she has no idea what she's walked into." But as she kept speaking, as the simple true words kept coming, that feeling changed, and I felt it change in myself, and saw it change on the faces around me. The embarrassment became attention. The attention became a kind of stunned recognition. Because every single being in that hall, every brilliant, proud scholar of the galaxy, knew, privately, in the place they never spoke from, that she was right. That they too had spent their lives performing certainty over a private terror of the unknowable. That they too were afraid, underneath all their mastery, of exactly the thing the old professor was afraid of. She was not just speaking to Professor Saelen. She was speaking to all of us, to the secret, frightened, not-knowing heart of the whole Athenaeum, and one by one, as she spoke, I watched the proud scholarly masks slip on the faces around me, watched hundreds of beings who had spent their lives never admitting ignorance feel something crack open in their chests, because a child had said the forbidden true thing out loud, and it turned out that hearing it was not a humiliation but a release. I felt it myself. I felt the exhausting performance of certainty that I had worn for years simply loosen, for a moment, in that hall, and underneath it I felt something I had forgotten I was allowed to feel, the simple peace of not having to pretend to know. And that is when the hall fell silent in the way the title of this story means. Because for the space of a few breaths, hundreds of the galaxy's proudest minds sat in that ancient hall and understood, all at once together, that a 19-year-old human who could barely pass her classes had just done something none of them, with all their brilliance, had ever managed to do. She had not answered the unanswerable question. She had done something better and braver. She had told an old dying man that he did not have to answer it either, that the not knowing was not a failure, that he could lay the impossible burden down, that his life had not been wasted in failing to prove the unprovable, because the meaning he had been trying to prove had been in the living of his life all along, in the 60 years of caring enough to ask. She had given him permission to stop, to rest, to die when his time came, not as a man who had failed to answer the great question, but as a man who had finally understood that it was the wrong question, and that he had been living the real answer the whole time. And Professor Saelen, the great Professor Saelen, the most revered mind in the galaxy, began, in front of the entire Athenaeum, to weep. It was the most extraordinary thing to watch. He did not weep the way you might expect a defeated man to weep. There was no humiliation in it, no collapse. He wept the way a person weeps when a weight they have carried for so long they had forgotten it was a weight is suddenly, gently, lifted from them. He had been standing at the lectern, as he always did when he posed the question, and now he sat slowly, lowering his old body into the chair behind him, and he put one of his long Vethkor hands over his face, and his shoulders moved, and the great hall watched its most celebrated mind weep like a child, and no one made a sound, because we all understood, finally, that we were watching something far more important than a scholarly debate. We were watching a dying man set down a burden he had carried for 60 years. We were watching mercy do, in 5 minutes, what brilliance had failed to do in 6 decades. And the human girl who had done it stood there, still trembling, not triumphant at all, frightened, in fact, that she had gone too far, that she had wounded the old man rather than freed him, until Professor Saelen lowered his hand from his wet face and looked across the hall at her, and the look on his old face was not pain. It was gratitude. It was the most naked gratitude I have ever seen on any face of any species, the gratitude of someone who has been drowning for a very long time and has just felt solid ground beneath their feet. Let me tell you what happened then, because the silence broke, eventually, and what broke it was the most extraordinary thing of all, not the human girl's answer, but the old professor's response to it, and what the two of them said to each other across that hall, an old dying scholar and a frightened young human, in front of the assembled wisdom of the galaxy. Because Myra had given Professor Saelen something. But he was about to give her something back, something she needed just as badly, though none of us, including her, had known it. The challenge was never going to have a winner. That was the thing the whole Athenaeum was about to learn. It was going to have something far rarer, 2 people, across the gulf of age and species and everything else, finally telling each other the truth. When Professor Saelen finally spoke, his voice was wet and broken and the most human-sounding thing I had ever heard come out of a Vethkor. And what he said was not to the hall. It was to her, the frightened girl who had freed him, and it was not thanks exactly. It was the thing she did not know she needed, the thing that turned her gift into something they gave each other. Let me tell you what he said, because it is the half of the story the galaxy always forgets, and it is the half that matters most to me. He looked across that great hall at Myra Castellanos, and he wiped his old face and he said, "Child, you think you've just embarrassed yourself in front of the finest minds in the galaxy. I can see it on you. You're standing there terrified that you've said something foolish, that you've overstepped, that all these brilliant people are going to laugh at the human girl who couldn't even answer the question properly. I want you to hear me, because I am the one person in this hall whose opinion you came here to fear, and I am telling you, you did not embarrass yourself. You just did the single bravest and truest thing I have witnessed in 60 years at this institution. And I need you to understand that, because I think you have spent your whole short life being told, in 1,000 small ways, that you are not enough, not brilliant enough, not certain enough, not impressive enough for a place like this. I have read your records. I asked about you after I noticed you in my lectures, always asking the questions no one else would ask. The faculty thinks you are struggling. They think you do not belong here." He paused. "They are wrong. You are the only student in this entire Athenaeum who actually belongs here, because you are the only one who still knows how to do the one thing this place was built for and forgot, to stand in front of what you do not know and not be ashamed and ask anyway. That is not a weakness, child. That is the whole of wisdom. Everything else is just decoration. I want to tell you what that did to her, because it is the part of the story I treasure most. Myra had come to the Athenaeum, I learned later, carrying exactly the wound the professor named. She was bright but not brilliant, in a place full of the brilliant. She had spent her months there feeling like a fraud, like a mistake, like a small, ordinary person who had wandered into a hall of giants and would soon be found out and sent home. She had stood up that day not out of confidence but almost out of despair, because she had nothing to lose, because she was going to fail anyway, because the only thing she had that the giants did not was her willingness to be honest about not knowing. And she had offered that, her one small humble thing, expecting to be humiliated for it. And instead the greatest mind in the galaxy had looked at her, in front of everyone, and told her that her one small humble thing was the most valuable thing in the room. I watched the words land on her. I watched her face crumple and then open, watched the fraud fear she had carried for months simply break apart, watched a young person receive, perhaps for the first time in her life, the knowledge that the thing she had always thought was her weakness was actually her gift. She began to cry too. Then the two of them, the old dying professor and the young frightened human, weeping at each other across that vast silent hall, having each given the other the exact thing they did not know they needed. He gave her permission to be enough. She gave him permission to rest. Neither of them had come into that hall expecting to be saved. Both of them left it saved. And then Professor Saelen did a thing that I think sealed it, that turned a moment into a bond. He rose slowly with effort, his old body protesting, and he came down from the lectern, down the long steps toward where Myra stood among the seated students, and the whole hall watched the most revered scholar in the galaxy walk to a frightened first-year human and stop in front of her. And he did not lecture her, or thank her formally, or do any of the grand scholarly things. He simply reached out with one old trembling Vethkor hand, and he took her small human hand in his, and he held it, and he said, quietly, just to her, though the great acoustics carried it to all of us, "Will you sit with me sometimes this year? I do not have many months left, and I find I would like to spend some of them talking with someone who is not afraid to not know things. I have been so lonely, child, among all these people who always know everything. I did not realize how lonely until just now." And Myra, weeping, nodded and held the old man's hand and said yes. And that small thing, the old master asking the frightened student to keep him company in his dying, was somehow the most moving moment of all, more than the answer, more than the applause, because it was the proof that nothing here was about winning. She had not defeated him. She had befriended him. The challenge that the galaxy thought would have a victor had instead produced, of all things, a friendship between an old dying scholar and a young human girl, the unlikeliest two people in that hall, brought together by the one thing they shared, which was the courage to admit they did not know. That is when the silence finally broke, and it broke in a way that had never happened in the 10,000-year history of the Athenaeum. Someone began to applaud. I do not know who started it. I have always liked to think it was another struggling student, someone like me, someone who had felt the cage and felt it open. But it started, somewhere in the hall, a single pair of hands, and then it spread, and within moments the entire Athenaeum, hundreds of the proudest, most brilliant, most certain minds in the galaxy were on their feet, applauding a 19-year-old human who had not answered the great question, who had instead done the far harder thing of telling the truth about not being able to. They were not applauding a victory. They were applauding a release, their own release, as much as the professor's. Every being in that hall had spent their life in the cage of having to seem to know, and a human child had just shown them the door was unlocked, had always been unlocked, that you could simply stand up and say, "I don't know," and not die of it but be freed by it. They were applauding the unlocking of their own cage. I was on my feet with them, applauding through my own tears, and I felt the years of performed certainty fall off me, and I thought, this is what this place was always supposed to feel like. We just forgot. Let me tell you what came after, because it matters, And because it is the part that makes me believe the whole thing was real and not just a beautiful moment. Professor Saelen retired the question. He never posed it again. At the next convocation he stood up, frailer now, near the very end, and he announced that the Saelen question was withdrawn, not because it had been answered but because he had finally understood that it was the wrong question, and that he had spent 60 years teaching the galaxy to be ashamed of not knowing when he should have been teaching it that not knowing, faced honestly, is where all real wisdom begins. He spent the last year of his life. He did not have long teaching differently. He taught his students to say, "I don't know." He made it the first lesson, the foundation of everything else. He told them the story of the human girl every term, so that they would understand that the bravest thing a scholar can do is admit the limits of their knowing. And the Athenaeum changed slowly because of it. It is a different place now, humbler, and for that reason finally truly wise. They teach there now that the performance of certainty is the enemy of learning, and that the words "I don't know" are not a confession of failure but the opening of every door. The carved names on the walls are still there, the 10,000 years of genius. But they added one more thing to that hall, after Professor Saelen died, a small plaque near the back where the students sit. It does not bear a great scholar's name. It bears 3 words, the 3 words a frightened human girl was brave enough to say in a room that had forgotten them. "I don't know," and under them, the beginning of wisdom. I should tell you that Myra did sit with him that last year as she promised. I saw them often, the 2 of them, in the libraries and the gardens of the Athenaeum, the ancient professor and the young human, heads bent together, talking. Not about the question, he was done with the question. About small things, I think, and ordinary things, and the things you talk about when you have stopped needing to prove anything. I do not know what they said to each other in those months. I never asked. It was theirs. But I saw the old professor in that last year, and he was changed. The grief was gone from him, the desperate weight I had glimpsed that night in the library, all of it simply gone. He died at peace. I was there near the end, and the last thing I heard of him was that he died easily, without fear, an old man who had finally understood that his caring had been the meaning all along, and who had spent his final months not chasing an answer but enjoying a friendship. He did not die as the man who failed to answer the great question. He died as the man who was finally free of needing to. And I changed too, Teppa, the frightened junior student who watched it all from 3 rows back. I have spent my life since trying to be the kind of scholar that day taught me to be. I say I don't know now, easily, the way Myra said it, and every time I do I feel the old cage stay unlocked. I have taught in my turn, and I have told my own students the story of the human girl and the dying professor, the way Saelen told it, so that the thing they understood in that hall will not be lost. It is the most important thing I know, and I did not learn it from any of the great texts on the carved walls. I learned it from a 19-year-old human who was brave enough to be honest in a room full of people pretending to be certain. Myra finished her studies. She was never the most brilliant student the Athenaeum produced. She would have been the first to tell you so, cheerfully, without shame, which was exactly the point. But she became something rarer than brilliant. She became wise, in the way the old professor had named, and she carried that wisdom back to humanity and out into the galaxy. And wherever she went she taught the thing she had taught the Athenaeum, the thing that is, I have come to believe, humanity's truest gift to the rest of us. Not that they are the smartest species or the strongest, but that they have never been ashamed to stand in front of the unknown and say, honestly, "I don't know, let's find out together." That is not a small thing. In a galaxy full of proud old species performing certainties they do not feel, it may be the most valuable thing there is. I followed her life. A little in the years after, we kept in touch, Myra and I, 2 people bound by the day we had both been remade. She did not become famous, not in the way the galaxy usually measures fame. She did not win great prizes or hold great offices. She became a teacher in the end, which I think was the only thing she was ever going to become, and she spent her life going to places where people were certain, proud institutions, rigid traditions, the comfortable fortresses of those who knew everything. And gently, patiently, with that same frightened courage she had shown in the hall, asking the questions no one would ask, admitting the things no one would admit, and showing people, one room at a time, that the door of their cage was unlocked. She told me once, late in her life, that she still did not know whether existence had meaning, that she had never found the proof and never would, and had made her peace with that long ago. But I stopped needing the proof, she said, the day I watched what happened to that old man when he finally put the question down. I don't know if life means anything, Teppa, but I know it feels like it does when you're brave enough to live it honestly, and I've decided that's enough. It was always enough. We just kept telling ourselves it wasn't. She died old and content and unafraid, the way the professor had, and I think that is the truest measure of what she understood. That she lived her whole life inside a question she never answered and was happy, because she had learned that the not knowing was never the enemy. The fear of it was, and she had let the fear go in a great hall when she was 19 by being brave enough to say 3 words out loud. The Galactic Council, the assembled wisdom of the Athenaeum, the finest minds of 100 species, fell silent when one human girl accepted the alien professor's challenge. That is true, but they did not fall silent because she was the cleverest being in the room. She was not. They fell silent because she was the most honest one, because a frightened 19-year-old who could barely pass her classes had the courage to say the 3 words that 10,000 years of genius had been too proud to speak, and in speaking them, set a dying man free, and unlocked a cage that hundreds of the galaxy's greatest minds had not even known they were living in. The answer to the greatest question in the galaxy turned out not to be an answer at all. It turned out to be a willingness to live, honestly and bravely, inside the not knowing, to love things you cannot prove, and help people for reasons you cannot derive, and let the mystery be a mystery, and find in the living of it the meaning that no proof could ever supply. An old professor spent 60 years looking for that answer on paper. A human child gave it to him in 5 minutes by simply telling the truth. And the truest, bravest, wisest thing, she said, the thing that silenced the galaxy and freed a dying man and remade the greatest school in existence, was the thing we are all most afraid to say, and the thing that said honestly sets us free. I don't know.